Few questions. See if you resonate with these. How difficult are the most difficult things in life? How difficult are the most difficult things in life? A couple examples. How difficult is it to be a good parent? Like honestly, when you take a step back out of the busyness of day in and day out, if you're raising children, how difficult is it every day to be a good parent? How difficult is it to have a great marriage? How difficult is that? How difficult is it to have a great marriage? I don't mean like a marriage that just gets by, but like a really honestly great marriage. How difficult is that? How difficult is it to take care of your parents when they can no longer take care of themselves? How difficult is it to find work when you're out of it and your family depends on you? This is real life. These are real problems. And honestly, we would like to ask the question this morning, God, could you give us a little insight? Could you bring us a little clarity? Because those things are difficult. There are easy moments in each one of those situations. There are moments when we feel like we've got it figured out. Maybe they are just fleeting. They're just here for a moment and then they're gone. But we do have moments or days where it's like, you know what, we got this. And then there are other moments when it's like we're drowning. Just drowning. The people of God were fighting for their lives. The Bible is split up into two parts. The first part, when you open it to the very first page, after you get past the table of contents and all that kind of stuff, when you get to actual meat of what's happening, you'll find a book called Genesis. It starts with chapter 1, verse 1. That begins the first part of the Bible, of the Old Testament. There's a New Testament which chronicles everything that happens with Jesus and then the result of Jesus' ministry on earth. But that first part is where we're going to be today. That's where we were last week, and that's where we're going to be today. And the first part tells the story of how God takes just a couple of people, a guy by the name of Abraham and his wife Sarah, and he births out of them through generation after generation the people of God. It becomes what we know today as the Jewish nation. He gave them a promised land. It wasn't always perfect for them, and so in this one particular instance where we're going to be in one of those early books in the Old Testament. It's entitled the Exodus. It's called Exodus because they exited slavery under Egypt. They got out. And so as they exited that, as they made their exodus out of it, this book really kind of goes into detail how the people of God took their lives from slavery and bondage for about 400 years into an actual nation of people. And this one particular instance, this is after they have exited slavery from Egypt. They are fighting for their lives. We will pick up in chapter 17. God is creating a nation. This nation is going to be how Jesus eventually comes into the world through a Jewish family. The line and the lineage of Jesus can be traced back all the way through to Abraham. And so we have this upstart nation of former slaves wandering in the desert, looking towards this promised land that God has given them. And as you can imagine, when a new nation comes into existence, specifically made up of former slaves, everyone who had a nation in the area, they're like, hey, where is this massive nation? We're talking about 2.5 million people at this moment in history. 2.5 million former slaves moving through the desert. And as they're moving through the desert, all of the surrounding communities are like, well, you ain't coming here. This is our spot. We done claimed this right here. So your 2.5 million people need to find another piece of sand, okay? Go find your other piece somewhere else. And so there were countries and cities, nations that weren't happy about it. One particular nation that wasn't happy about it were the Amalekites. We don't get a ton of insight. into the Amalekites. We get a little bit of family history, but I'm not going to go into that. They're kind of mentioned, and then they're almost gone. There's one other mention after this particular incident, and then they're pretty much gone, and nobody hears from them again. We'll pick up in Exodus 17, verses 8 through 10. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, Moses was leading the people of God at the time. His understudy, or his right-hand man was Joshua. And Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. And so the Amalekites have come to fight the people of God. And as they've come to fight them, Moses sees them from a long way off. He said, hey, my battle man, the leader of my army, take a few folks. Let's go take care of this. I'm going to stand up on the hill with the staff of God, me, my brother Aaron, this guy named Hur, and I'm going to stand there with the staff, and I'm going to oversee the battle that's taking place below us. If this staff is new to you, you're like, man, does God still have a staff? Well, this particular staff was pretty significant because it was used in the Exodus. And so as Pharaoh went to Egypt and to the Pharaoh, there was a number of conversations, 10 specific conversations that happened. And as they have these conversations, the staff is a part of that. So God's got some power in this staff. The staff is a part of he parts an entire sea for the people to cross on dry ground. The staff has been a huge part of the people of Israel up until this point, right? So that's what's happening. And so we're going to pick up right after that. 17, 11 through 13. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. And so they have this battle. Joshua's down there doing his thing, and Moses is standing there with the staff of God, and he's standing on top of the hill, and he puts his hands up, and as long as his hands are raised, they're winning. But then when they get tired and he lowers them, they begin to lose. And then the story ends. They give him a seat to sit on, and then two guys hold his hands up, and Joshua beat them. It actually says, right, there's a verse after that says, and then we're going to wipe these people from the face of the planet. But I left that part out, right? Because that's not a part of it, right? But that's where the story ends. We're going to wipe them from the face of the planet, and then end the story, period. Let's move on to something else. That's the whole story. And so I'm asking, God, why did you put this story in here? Number one, it's just difficult for me I can picture it. It's like a Disney movie. There's like Moses standing up there on top, and then when he gets tired, like the whole battlefield starts going this way. But when he pulls it up, it starts going this way. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just, there's a big cloud of dust, and the dust cloud moves back and forth. Eventually it clears, and the good guys are winning. And so why did you put it in there, though, God? Is there wisdom that we can take from this particular odd and just unique story that's in the Bible? Well, a few things. Let's start with the first thing. I believe this shows us a pretty decent picture of what a great team looks like. Joshua's leading the army. The army is actually doing the fighting. Moses is standing with his arms up. And Aaron and Hur are making sure they stay up. Everybody has a role to play. Everybody's got a role to play. Question, though, as we kind of take a look at what a great team looks like, the question becomes, how many times did Aaron and Hur have to watch Moses' hands fall and see their people start to lose before they stepped in and said, you know what, maybe you should sit down and let us hold your hands up? That's a real question. When you talk about people in leadership being approachable, when you're sitting there working with them on a team, right, and someone's leading a project or leading a team, leading a ministry event, leading a service project, leading a group, whatever it is, right, whatever that leader is, and they got a plan. Hey, I'm going to hold my hands up and we're going to win. And you're standing back here in support. right? You're doing your thing. Well, I don't know if Aaron was taking notes. I don't know if Her was taking Instagram pictures and posting it on a story for, hey, we're doing great today. I don't know what they were doing, but they were standing back there just doing their thing, and they saw his hands drop, and they saw the momentum shift. How many times did it have to happen before they got the guts to say, hey, you know what, Moses, maybe we should try something different? I don't know if you're noticing this, but when your hands drop, we start to lose, so maybe we can figure something else out. How approachable are the leaders in your life? More specifically, if you're someone who leads anything, how approachable are you? How many times do the people that you serve with, or how many times do the people that you lead with in your job, or at your occupation, wherever it is, or maybe your household, where you have to fall flat on your face before they have the courage or the confidence to say, you know what, we've got a better idea? How approachable are you? I want to talk about church for a second, because I believe that our church, Big C Church, like our church, the church of believers collectively, ought to be an incredible example of what teams should look like. Like, we should have the greatest teams because we have the greatest cause, right? Like, we believe that we have a message that the entire world would benefit from, regardless of where they're from, what their baggage is, their background, their experience, what language they speak, who they currently worship today, whether they worship anyone or not. We believe that we have the single unifying thing for all of mankind, and that is that Jesus gave his entire life so that he could spend eternity with them, right? So if we want to accomplish that mission, we've got to figure out, how do we become an incredible team? So, how confident do you feel approaching anyone in our church that's in a leadership position when you see things not working? Have we positioned ourselves in a way where you could come and say, hey, I've seen your hands drop 3 or 4 times, and I know you don't mean it. You're just tired. Can I help hold them up? Or are you afraid someone's going to turn around and look at you and say, hey, I don't need your help. If I need your help, I ask for it. Has our church positioned ourselves in a place just here with the people in this room? Now, I'll be honest, we talk to our leaders all the time, and we're very clear. Hey, we have to be approachable because our business, right? Our business is the message of Jesus. And we want that to be the most approachable thing on the planet. And so if we're the carriers of that, if we're helping other people begin to carry it, we've got to lead on that front for how to carry the message of Jesus in an approachable way. So we train our leaders, hey, you got to be approachable. Not that they're perfect at it, but they ought to be working towards it, constantly working towards it. However, we do have to make a separation, right? There's a large difference between someone's preference and someone's priority, And so if you've been here for a while, you'll know that when I tell people, hey, if you have loved Jesus a really long time, you should be in a place where your preferences no longer matter as much as everyone else's. Because that's ultimately where Jesus got to. He was like, I got a bunch of preferences, but I'm going to shove them all the way down. In fact, he says, my preference was to stay with God, right? But I held everything in my hand, Jesus said. I held everything in my hand, and I let it go. Paul tells us that's what Jesus did. He held equality with God and let it go to become like us. And so the more we become like Jesus, the more our preferences just don't matter as much, right? Now, there's a difference between preferences and priorities. When you are here and you're a part of things, and you're like, man, I know that reaching lost people who are unbelievers, are a massive priority, and this is a huge block to that. Man, we want to hear that. You ought to have confidence to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what's what. Preferences would be like, well, you know what? I don't like that so many people on the stage wear skinny jeans. I don't know what to tell you. That's your preference. You get your mom jeans anywhere you want, okay? Was that a line? Did I step over the line? Okay, my bad. They don't have to be mom jeans, just whatever. I don't know. I don't know. You see the difference between priorities and preferences? We ought to be approachable on the things that we have decided, hey, these things matter. And sometimes we can become house blind to our priorities, and we always have to be in a place to say, hey, I'm ready for the feedback, right? And that was a side note. Back to the picture of a good team, right? We got Joshua leading the army. The army's fighting the Amalekites. Moses is standing with his arms up. Aaron and Hur are making sure they stay up, right? Here's the question. Which one of those four were the most important? It's a good question. You might say Moses because all the power is in his hands, right? But the thing is, all the power's there, but he can't actually do anything with the power that God has given him unless Aaron and Hur support his arms to keep him up. But here's the other thing. His hands going up with a tumbleweed down in the field against the Amalekites doesn't push them back anywhere. There's got to be an army. There's got to be someone leading them. So there's four different people, four different groups of people, four different positions. Which one's the most important? I think we find that when God does something, he brings a team of people together, and they have equal significance because he designed each person to fill a specific role. And God doesn't create fluff roles. God doesn't create just space to be filled where he says, you know what, well, I ain't doing nothing else, and so I hate this, but I feel real guilty because I ain't doing nothing, so I'm going to step into it. That's not what God does. God doesn't want you to do that. God doesn't want you to half-heartedly jump in on a team, jump into a group, serve somewhere, volunteer in the community. He does not want you to do that. He wants you to do it with purpose. And you know what else is completely true? He wants you to figure out, take some time to discover how you were built and wired. Asking those questions, why did God put me here? And so we tell all of our team leads, hey, if someone signs up to be on your team, they might be in a process of discovery. It's okay if in 6 weeks they come to you and say, hey, I found out I'm not designed for this. And we want that. Because the last thing we want is you continuing to pour into that place and you hate it and you know this isn't what God made you for. We want to help you find another place. Puzzle pieces only fit in a specific place. That's because the master puzzle maker designed it to go that way. And he made you to fit in a specific place. Now, what's not okay is for you to lay upside down on the table, right? Flip yourself over. Let's start seeing where you fit in the picture. Let's put you down in a couple of places to figure out, do you fit here? And then be okay with moving into another position that might be a better fit. Eventually, we'll get it. I guess the real question about the wisdom in this story, because those are just a few small things, I think there's greater wisdom, and here's the question. Did Moses learn anything from this experience? More specifically, have we learned anything from this experience? Because Moses is dead. So honestly, it doesn't make a hill of beans a difference whether he learned anything or not. He's had his chance, right? It's whether we can learn anything from Moses' experience. Let's see how he does. We're going to go right to that next story that just seems incredibly random, but here it goes. Moses has his wife and children returned to him. Moses' wife and children in chapter 18 are brought back to him with his father-in-law, right? His wife's father. And they had been away from him for a while he was going through the talks with Pharaoh and the battle and all that kind of stuff and the huge journey. They were separated, right? So his wife and his two kids were gone back with the father-in-law to hang out while he was going through all this conflict. And now his father-in-law is bringing his wife and his children to him, right? And so here you'll pick up in Exodus 18, 7 through 9. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. Pretty customary greeting for this particular time. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way and how the Lord had saved them. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hand of the Egyptians. And so Moses tells him all these things. Hey, Jethro, there was this one time I took the staff and I put it in the water and the Red Sea parted and 2.5 million people walked across an entire sea on dry land. And there was these other times where we did these plagues happen, and then just all, like that's the big thing, like the whole story of going up against the largest army on the planet at the time and knocking them down. So he's telling them all these things, and Jethro's just like, man, that's incredible. That's incredible. Now, to give you a little background, Jethro leads a people of his own. In fact, he is the leader of the Midianites, right, from Midian. And so he's from Midian. He's the leader of this entire huge, massive tribe of people. And so he understands leading people. In fact, he's got a decent resume. He's been leading people longer than Moses has, right? And it's been successful. And so he's listening to him like leader on leader. And he's like, man, that's so cool. That's so great. This is good. He's pumped, right? He's pumped. Jethro is a man's man, living in the wilderness, leading a nation of people. Now, I don't know what Jethro thought when Moses came to him, his son-in-law, and said, hey, pop-in-law, I'm going to take me and my brother, and we're going to go and free 2.5 million of my fellow people from the largest, most powerful army in the world. And Jethro was like, you ain't taking my army. No, I ain't taking your army. Just me and my brother. Just me and Aaron. We're going to march in to the capital city and say, let my people go, you know? You know what I'm saying? He's like, you feeling lucky, you know? That kind of thing. I don't know what Jethro was thinking. I'm not sure. I don't know if he was just like, oh, you are nuts. Yeah, have fun. And as soon as he walked out the door, he was like, Zipporah, you're going to have to find you another man because that guy's a loon, you know? I don't know. He's never coming back. I don't know what happened. Bible doesn't tell us. I know for one thing, if my daughter, never mind, it doesn't matter. It's fine. Let's just, that's another line I want to step over. Exodus 18, 10 through 12. He said, praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. So Moses is riding high, right? So maybe there's a poor interaction, we don't know, as he waves to his wife goodbye and his father-in-law, like, hey, I'm going to go free 2.5 million people from the largest army in the world, me and the stick, right? Maybe that's what he's thinking. But either way, now they're like on equal footings. One's a leader of a people, the other one's a leader of a people. One has gone up against people and saved it. The other one's been protecting his people for years, right? And so Jethro comes to this place where he's like, man, because of what I've seen in your life, I now know that the God you worship is greater than any other God. Man, what kind of day is that for you to be in on your father-in-law's realization that God is who he says he is? That's a day. And then on top of that, Jethro provides dinner that night. On top of that, they have dinner in the presence of God. That's a day. I can't imagine what Moses is thinking. We get some insight. 18, 13 through 15. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people. And they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? Moses answered him, because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions. So Moses is feeling good. It's like bring your father-in-law to work day, you know? And so Jethro comes along, and Moses is sitting in the judgment seat, and Jethro's over there like, man, he's got a lot to do. And there's hundreds and hundreds of people lined up, and Moses is taking one as they come, just every one of them. And so Jethro finally says, hey, what are you doing? He's like, the entire nation of Israel comes to me for God's will. Like, I know you thought I was a pretty cool guy with that stick, But I also know the will of God for all 2.5 million people. And they come to me every day for me to tell them what's what. How about that, father-in-law? You know what I'm saying? So I'm sure in Moses' mind, he was about to get the, man, you have surpassed me in leadership of people. I ought to pin a medal on you, right? Not so much. In fact, we pick up in 17 and 18 of chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law lays it out. He says this, Moses' father-in-law replied, what you are doing is not good. I think that's hilarious. You don't think that's hilarious? What you are doing, no, son, this is terrible. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You can't handle it alone. Man, that high Moses has been on, he just went in the toilet. I mean, he was like, oh. Notice he says, you and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. It wasn't only Moses that had put himself in a position to handle every single care of every single person, right? He wasn't the only one that had done something that wasn't right. The other people had allowed it to happen. And the sum of those two things was both of them, the group of people that sought his wisdom, and Moses himself, would wear themselves out. In other words, when one person bears the entire burden, that person becomes a burden. Think about that for a second. When one person bears the entire burden, that person becomes a burden. Isn't that true in our life? Isn't that true when someone gets extremely, like, hey, I've got this sense of responsibility, and I'm gonna go all in, and it's my responsibility, it's no one else's responsibility, and I'm gonna shoulder this load all on my own, and I don't need anyone's help because this is my thing, and this is what God's put in front of me, and I've caused it, so it's my responsibility to fix it, and I'm not accepting any help, I'm not accepting any well wishes, none of that, this is my problem, this is it, and then ultimately they become a burden too, right? Because it's not sustainable. And so then, as they're shouldering that burden, as they're shouldering that load on their own, then they begin to break down because they can't stand up under the weight of it. And so you got to jump in anyway, but it's not at the right time. The right time was when they were standing up, putting the burden on to begin with. But we do. We jump in, and then we've got the burden that was originally there, and then the burden of the broken person that's trying to bear the weight of all of it. When one person bears the entire burden, that person becomes a burden. So if that's you today, in this moment, if you've got that and that's your attitude, this is my thing, I did it to myself, and I'm going to get myself out of it. I don't want anyone's help. I don't want anyone's advice. Stop. It's okay to get help. It's okay to have someone give you some advice. Yeah, even your father-in-law. Right? Probably the people you don't want to hear it from, hear it. Let someone else step in. He doesn't just stop with, hey, that ain't good, son. He actually gives them some incredibly practical advice. Listen to this. 18:21. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. He gives some pretty great advice for teams. Pretty great advice. Whatever your burden is, whatever your task is, whatever your responsibility is, whatever your mission is, whatever it is that you are undertaking in your life, invite others to join you. Invite others into the story that God is writing in your life. But be careful. Be careful. And Jethro sees that there's a need for people to jump in. He sees that there's a need for people to join in the carrying of the burden, but he also recognizes that he doesn't need people who care a ton about their preferences. He needs people who care a ton about the mission that's in front of them. And so he says, hey, there's 3 qualifiers when you say, hey, you know what, I got this huge burden, it's gonna bear me down. When you're looking for people to help you, look for these 3 things. People who fear God, people who are trustworthy, people who hate dishonest gain. People who fear God, people who are trustworthy, people who hate dishonest gain. And so maybe you're thinking, well, okay, let's flesh that out a little bit. So let's just, whatever problem we've got going on in our life, right? Whatever problem we got going on in our life. Let's just take a common one. Problems with our spouse, right? Problems with our spouse. Let's just say we've got this marriage issue, this marriage friction that's happening, and it's just not getting any better. It's not getting any better. So most of you probably have some people in your life that you can go and get a little advice from, right? You can go get some advice from. And typically you have a handful of folks. I would ask the question, hey, what are the chances that you're gonna go ask advice from your friend who just got divorced? They're probably not the best person to ask, right? They're just not. Now, will they be at some point down the line where they can say, you know what, I've taken a step back, I've learned a ton from what I've gone through? But right there in the moment, man, when I get to talk with people who get divorced, their heart is like broken and tore up. And a lot of times they're like, yeah, you know what, she did mean it that way. Let's tear this thing apart too, you know? Just be careful about the people that you go to. Make sure they're in a frame of mind that they can actually help. Make sure that they're people who fear God. You can't go about your Christian marriage. You can't go about what God has called you to, because there's a grace that exists in people who follow Jesus that doesn't exist for people who don't follow Jesus. They don't understand that. So you can't go to a group of folks that are over here that fill in the blank, right? But they don't follow Jesus and they don't get that side of grace. And I'm like, no, if he's going to do that, you better do this back to him. If she's going to do that, you better get even. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. He said, hey, you gotta help bear this load. You got to carry this weight. Invite people into the story, but make sure you're inviting the right people into the story. Invite people who are looking to God first for their answers. People who are trustworthy. I think that one's self-explanatory. This one right here gets us sometimes. People who hate dishonest gain. Now, we're not talking about money necessarily. We're talking about even sometimes social standing, right? So let's go back to the same issue. You're having an issue and you want to go seek counsel. And so you go to someone who you know has a huge issue, just yapping their mouth with everything anybody tells them, because they get gain from the stories they can tell other people, right? The Bible will call it gossip, right? So you don't want people like that helping bear your burden, because all they're doing is leveraging your misfortunes for their gain in conversations with other people. And so Jethro is trying to tell Moses, stay away from those folks. In the midst of your trials and struggles, you don't need people to come alongside of you who don't acknowledge Jesus, who don't think that there's grace beyond grace. You don't need people that aren't trustworthy. You don't need folks that are going to take your misfortune and use it for their social gain. At the end of the day, to successfully bear our burdens, we must bear them with others. But yes, it matters who the others are. If you're someone invited into the story, maybe you should ask the question of yourself, can I be trusted with this great responsibility? Am I giving them Jesus' first advice? Is the thought even in my mind that I would leverage their misfortune for the gain of my own social acceptability? Those are questions we should all be asking of ourselves when someone calls in the middle of heartache, in the middle of troubles and trials. Because it matters. Because remember, many of the things we started out with, how can God be good if God always lets me down? Here's part of that answer. Because God designed us to live in community, and he has chosen to give his Spirit, the very Spirit that was there in the very beginning of Genesis. It says the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. We say often that the Spirit of God has a deep, abiding affection for everything God has created, especially us. And so God has given us his Spirit to live inside of us, which means that God has primarily chosen 99% of the time to work in your life through a Holy Spirit-filled believer. That's the truth. And so a lot of times when we say, man, God let me down, it wasn't God. God had a plan. Sometimes we let each other down, and God gets the blame for it. Or sometimes we refuse to reach out and allow the Holy Spirit-filled believers to step in our life and help shoulder our burden with us. And so we've let ourselves down because we have too much pride, and we refuse to help. We refuse the advice. We refuse the hands that are reaching out to help us take a step up. We refuse all of that. And so we've let ourselves down, and God gets the blame for it. Now, I know there are still exceptions where there are other things that happen in our life that has nothing to do with people. And like I said, this is not a complete answer. We can't give the complete answer in just one sitting. But I do know a large majority of the answer has to do with our ability to live inside of community and respond to one another's needs. Our definition here of serving at Foundation is to be inconvenienced for someone else's good. And so we look at bearing one another's burden. That's the question we're asking ourselves. If it's always convenient for us, if it's always, well, that's on my way, so no big deal. I was going to stop there anyway. That's just being nice and kind. Serving someone takes getting a little inconvenienced, most of the time a lot inconvenienced. Because honestly, they're none of our burdens, right? They're our friends' burdens. And our life would be much simpler without them. But what kind of life would that be? What if we're not stepping into the promise and the plan of God? Because inconvenience is just something that scares us. Or maybe you think, you know what? That's a great story, Clint, but that story is thousands of years old. You know, the Old Testament just points to Jesus, right? He points to the work of Jesus. The Apostle Paul, the original church planter, one of the greatest church planters, he says this in Galatians 6, chapter 2. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way fulfill the law of Christ. So this wasn't just an Old Testament thought process of provide a stool and hold his hands up. Provide other people to share the burden of helping people with their issues and their problems. The question really becomes, what is the law of Christ? What is the law of Christ? Thankfully, Jesus' brother, James, gives us a pretty clear indication in James chapter 2, verse 8. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. In other words, help bear the burdens of the people in your community as you would want them to help bear your burdens. How difficult is it to be a good parent? It's hard. But it's not as difficult if you're willing to ask someone who fears God, who's trustworthy, and hates dishonest gain. How difficult is it to have a great marriage? It's incredibly difficult. But it's not as difficult if you're willing to ask someone who fears God, is trustworthy, and hates dishonest gain. How difficult is it to take care of your parents when they can no longer take care of themselves? Incredibly difficult, but not as difficult if you're willing to ask someone who fears God, is trustworthy, and hates dishonest gain? How difficult is it to find work when you're out of it and your family depends on you? Incredibly difficult. But not as difficult if you're willing to ask someone who fears God, is trustworthy, and hates dishonest gain. God wants you to be a part of his team. All you have to do is say yes. Just take the pride, throw it away. Say, yeah. Let me shoulder this with some other people who fear God, are trustworthy, and hate dishonest gain.